I keep coming back to a problem in physics that I kind of thought we understood. But the more that I dig into it, the more that I realize we don't. It's much stranger than at first it seems. But before we go there, let's just take a couple of steps back. There are certain things in physics that we learn from an early age, almost without noticing. We stop thinking about them. We just accept them for what they are. We simply don't question them from that point onwards. Not because we understand them or that we've answered the question, but rather we've been taught not to ask about it any further. So let's just make this a little bit more concrete, because at the moment it sounds a little bit vague and wishy-washy. Inertia, as an example. We know what it does. It's an object resists acceleration. But why do we never ask why the resistance is there in the first place? It's not like we've answered the question, so why don't we ask that question anymore? And I would argue that it's because we've almost trained ourselves to think the question isn't even necessary. That once something works, mathematically, the job's done. We have an equation and we're happy. We have a model and it fits in the model. Now, Ernst Mach asked a very similar question. He felt uneasy with the idea that inertia could just exist on its own. He wanted to understand what gave rise to inertia, and he wasn't satisfied with it just being a property of matter. He wanted to, in a sense, ground it, not just predict it. Now, if we take the concept to its extreme and imagine a universe with just one single object in it, then inertia no longer has any meaning, because it's not moving relative to anything, it's not resisting relative to anything. And that idea, as simple as it sounds, makes you realize that motion only makes sense in a universe full of matter. In a sense, what we're saying is that motion has to be relative to something else. And Mach kept returning to that idea. That in a sense, nothing in physics existed in isolation. He didn't say that he had the answers, but what he was saying was that the question hadn't gone away. We couldn't ignore it. And this way of thinking, I think, makes people feel uncomfortable, because it refuses to stop at the equation. You're going beyond it. You're asking what sits underneath that equation. And Einstein took this idea very seriously. He was deeply suspicious of anything that felt absolute. He didn't want space-time to be a silent stage that objects moved across. The dream for him was that space-time itself would be shaped entirely by matter, nothing left over. And in that picture, inertia wouldn't be imposed, it would emerge. In a sense, Einstein was attempting to bake Mach's intuition into the geometry of space-time itself. He wanted the universe to explain its own structure. But something subtle happened along the way while he was going through this process. General relativity still allowed solutions where inertia existed even without matter. The equations worked, but Mach's demand wasn't fully satisfied. Unfortunately, Einstein couldn't make inertia depend on the rest of the universe without breaking the theory. He knew the theory worked, but he also knew that something had been lost. Now, at this point, you might just say, fine, it's just a historical footnote. So what? Big deal. But returning to the start, it shows how deeply questions can get buried under successful maths. How quickly we stop asking those difficult questions when we have an equation that hides essentially what's beneath it. There's nothing wrong with the equation, that's not the point. But it strikes at the heart of what we've been discussing, the acceptance of an equation that gives results versus a deeper understanding of why that result happens in the first place. It, in a sense, shows how deeply questions can get buried under successful maths. And here's where history also has a hand in Mach's story. He didn't get proved wrong. We, in a sense, just stopped talking about it. We had an equation that could give us a way to calculate inertia, and we stopped asking where inertia came from. In a very real sense, the symbol of inertia, ended up replacing the explanation. Now, the same uncomfortable questions can also be asked about the constants of nature. And that last part, the constants of nature bit, the nature bit, is actually a really funny turn of phrase. Just hold on to that, because we will be coming back to that. Now, we accept the constants, the speed of light, the gravitational constants, blah, 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 but we never actually stop to think about them. Where exactly does that number come from? Why that number and not a different one? Often we're just told that's the way it is. It just happens that our universe is born with exactly those numbers, not others. Maybe there exists a universe somewhere else that has different values to our values. Ours just randomly got these. Again, here it's worth noticing the same pattern. How we've completely given up on the question, why? Okay, yeah. At this point, I probably feel it's worth anchoring this in a little analogy. So let's just say that all cakes are sweet. You simply leave it at that. You build a whole science of baking in this manner. But you never ask the deeper question, why does sweetness appear everywhere in the cake? And the moment you realize it comes from something you added earlier, something mixed into everything, the whole picture changes. Now, as I said, this is not a perfect analogy, but it's the shift in thinking that matters. And that shift is what caught my attention when I looked at cosmic relativity. Not because it claims to rewrite large parts of physics. It doesn't. It quietly reopens a door that I think was closed too early. It turns relativity on its head. Well, it uses relativity but shifts how you look at it. And I think it's that shift that does something that I think is quite profound. It says, what if inertia and even the constants are, in a sense, tied to the gravitational potential of the entire universe itself? What if the laws don't float free, but they come from nature? So, let's be clear here. What Unikrishna proposes here is a fundamental shift where the matter in the universe helps to determine the constants that we see. That's not arbitrary. It's not a random number game. The same universe with the same matter content would create the same values. And I think importantly, it gives us back a relationship between the world we live in and the equations we see in a way that Einstein never could. Now, cosmic relativity doesn't solve maths' problem, but it takes his discomfort seriously. One thing that is worth saying openly is that none of this is complete. Cosmic relativity isn't a finished product. Now, I explored this idea in more detail elsewhere, but what interests me here isn't the theory itself. It's the kind of questions it allows us to ask again. For me, this is a kind of doorway to being able to ask those types of questions again. And maybe that's the real problem that I keep coming back to. Not that we don't have answers, but that we've stopped asking certain types of questions.